In 2014, a man died on a park bench. In Portland, Oregon, no ID, no wallet, shoes held together with duct tape. The coroner ran his fingerprints expecting to find a criminal record. Instead, they found $800 million in real estate, a penthouse he'd never slept in, and a family who'd been looking for him for 11 years. This man chose to be homeless, and the reason why, it's going to change how you think about money forever. Today, I'm going to tell you the full story, the real story, of how one of America's richest real estate investors walked away from everything, lived on the streets by choice, and died before anyone could ask him the one question that matters: why? We tracked down his family. We found the psychiatrist who almost saved him. And we uncovered a detail about his final 72 hours that has never been reported anywhere. You're not ready for this. Now, I want to be up front. We spent 4 months researching this. We pulled property records, county assessor files, exposed court documents that were supposed to be sealed. Every single dollar amount you're about to hear, verified. This isn't some Reddit story someone made up. This is one of the most documented cases of what psychiatrists call voluntary desiccation. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why a man with $800 million chose to eat out of dumpsters. Let's start from the beginning. Before we begin, drop in the comments what city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story, 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. 1983. Portland, Oregon. A 27-year-old named, let's call him Edward Hartwell, inherits a small apartment building from his grandfather. Nothing crazy. 12 units, worth maybe $2 million. But Edward does something nobody expects. Instead of selling it and buying a Corvette like any normal 27-year-old, he takes out a loan against the building, buys another building, then another, then another. By 1991, Edward Hartwell owns 47 properties across Portland and Seattle. By 98, he's worth over $200 million. By 2003, he crosses the line. 800 million. He is, by any definition, one of the richest men in the Pacific Northwest. And here's where this story takes a turn that I genuinely did not believe the first time I read it. On March 14, 2003, Edward Hartwell received a phone call at his downtown Portland office. Nobody, not his wife, not his business partner, not his lawyer, knows exactly what was said on that call. But what we do know is this. Within 72 hours of hanging up that phone, Edward Hartwell liquidated 0 assets, told 0 people, and walked out of his own life. He left his car in the driveway, his wallet on the kitchen counter, his phone on his desk, and he was not seen by anyone who knew him for 11 years. Where did he go? That's Act 2. To understand why someone walks away from everything, you first have to understand what everything actually looked like. Edward Hartwell didn't live like a normal rich person. He lived like a character from a movie that would get criticized for being unrealistic. $12 million estate in Lake Oswego, $340 million in Portland commercial real estate alone, another $180 million in Seattle. $47 million just sitting in cash and securities. He had a private chef, a driver, a personal assistant who literally ironed his socks. This man's socks were ironed every single morning. But here's the thing that makes this story hit different. Edward wasn't some Wall Street villain hoarding gold coins in a vault. People who knew him describe a man who was generous to a fault. He funded 3 community centers. He paid for his employees' kids' college tuitions, plural, multiple kids, full rides. His Thanksgiving dinners were legendary. He'd rent out entire restaurant floors and invite everyone from his building managers to the janitors. One former employee told us, and this is a direct quote, "Edward was the kind of guy who remembered your dog's name and asked about your mother. That's not the profile of someone who abandons their life." Edward married his college sweetheart, we're calling her Margaret, in 1984. They had 2 kids, a daughter born in 86 and a son born in 89. And by every account, this was not a troubled marriage. Friends described them as the couple you wanted to be. Margaret was a pediatric nurse. She worked 3 days a week at a free clinic, even though she was married to a man worth $800 million. She drove a Honda Accord, not because Edward was cheap, but because she wanted to. That context matters, because when Edward disappeared, the first theory everyone had was bad marriage. But that theory falls apart the moment you talk to anyone who actually knew them. But here's where the people closest to Edward start telling a slightly different story. And this is subtle, so subtle that nobody connected the dots until years after he vanished. Starting around 2001, Edward began doing something odd. He'd cancel meetings last minute, not important meetings, small ones. A lunch here, a coffee there. His assistant noticed he'd sit in his office for hours, sometimes doing nothing, not on the phone, not reading, just sitting. His wife Margaret later told investigators that he'd started sleeping in the guest room. Not every night, just occasionally. When she asked why, he said he didn't want to wake her. Totally reasonable explanation. Unless you stack it next to everything else. So we built a timeline. And when you lay it out, the pattern is chilling. 2001 starts canceling meetings and sleeping separately. 2002 makes a $3 million anonymous donation, not through his foundation, directly, as if he didn't want a record. Same year, stops going to board meetings for 3 straight weeks. A security guard reports seeing him walking alone through downtown Portland at 2 in the morning. And then, in early 2003, he walks into his lawyer's office and says, and this was in the deposition, "I need to know that my buildings will survive without me." His lawyer thought he meant retirement. He did not mean retirement, which brings us back to that phone call. March 14th, 2003, 3:47 in the afternoon. Edward's assistant confirmed the call came in on his direct line, not through the front desk. It lasted 11 minutes. She didn't hear what was said. His door was closed. But she told investigators that when he came out of his office after that call, he looked, her exact words, like someone had told him something he already knew. Not shocked, not angry, almost relieved? That's the word she used, relieved. And within 72 hours, Edward Hartwell was gone. Here's what the next 72 hours looked like. Day 1 after the call, Edward goes home, normal dinner. Why, helps his son with homework, kisses his wife goodnight. Nothing unusual. Day 2, goes to work, signs 3 lease agreements, has lunch with his building manager, comes home, normal. Day 3, March 17th. Edward gets up before dawn. He does not pack a bag. He does not leave a note. He places his wallet on the kitchen counter, his phone on his desk in the home office, and his car keys on the hook by the front door. And then Edward Hartwell walks out of his $12 million home in Lake Oswego, Oregon, on foot, and simply ceases to exist. Margaret woke up at 7:15 a.m. to an empty bed. She assumed Edward had gone for a walk. He did that sometimes. By 9 a.m. she started calling his phone. It rang from inside the house. That's when the fear hit. She checked the garage. Both cars were there. His wallet? On the counter. She called his office. He hadn't shown up. She called his lawyer. Hadn't heard from him. By 11:42 a.m., Margaret Hartwell filed a missing persons report for her husband, a man who, on paper, was worth $800 million, and had vanished, with nothing but the clothes on his back. The investigation hit a wall almost immediately. No passport activity, so he didn't leave the country. No credit card charges, anywhere. No ATM withdrawals. No bus tickets, train tickets, plane tickets, no contact with any known associate, no ransom demand, no enemies, no lawsuits, no financial problems. And here's the detail that made the detectives' heads spin. Edward Hartwell had $800 million in assets and $47 million in liquid cash, and he left without taking a single dollar. Not one. Who does that? What kind of person walks away from $800 million with empty pockets? That question haunted this investigation for over a decade. And I need you to sit with this for a second, because we get so caught up in the mystery and the money that we forget. There were 2 kids in that house. His daughter was 17, his son was 14. They woke up one morning and their father was just gone. No goodbye, no explanation, no letter, nothing. The daughter, she later told a journalist, that for the first 2 years she checked the front door every single night before bed, not to lock it, to make sure it was unlocked. In case he came home. She was 19 years old, in leaving the door unlocked for a father who had $800 million, and chose to leave without saying a word. The family didn't give up. They hired 3 different private investigators. They offered a $500,000 reward. They ran ads in every major newspaper from Portland to Vancouver. Local news covered it, national news briefly covered it, and nothing. Absolutely nothing. No credible sightings, no tips, no body. Edward Hartwell had evaporated. And as the months turned into years, the world moved on. The case went cold. The reward expired. The private investigators sent their final invoices, and the family was left with something worse than grief. They were left with not knowing. Because when someone dies, you mourn. When someone vanishes, you exist in permanent limbo. Now, if this story ended there, rich man disappears, family is devastated, nobody ever finds out what happened, it would be tragic, but it wouldn't be the story I'd spend 4 months researching. What makes this story unlike anything I've ever covered is what happened next, because Edward Hartwell wasn't dead, he wasn't kidnapped, he wasn't hiding in another country under a fake name, he was 6 miles from his house, 6 miles, living under a bridge. And he'd been there the entire time, 6.2 miles. That's the distance between Edward Hartwell's $12 million estate in Lake Oswego and the spot under Portland's Burnside Bridge, where he set up a makeshift camp with a tarp, a sleeping bag he got from a shelter, and a shopping cart he found behind a Safeway. 6 miles. And his wife drove over that bridge twice a week going to the free clinic where she worked. She drove directly over her husband and didn't know it. Let that sink in. For 11 years, Margaret Hartwell drove over her missing husband's head. Now your first question is obvious. How does a man worth $800 million live on the streets of his own city and not get recognized? And the answer is simpler and more disturbing than you think. Homelessness makes you invisible, not metaphorically, literally. Studies show that people on the street make eye contact with homeless individuals less than 4% of the time. Edward grew out his beard. He lost weight. He wore layers of donated clothing, and within 6 months, he didn't look like Edward Hartwell anymore. He looked like every other person. The world had decided not to see. His own business partner walked past him on a sidewalk in 2007. We confirmed this. Walked right past him. Didn't even glance. We pieced together Edward's daily routine from shelter records, witness accounts, and one remarkable source I'll get to in a minute. His day looked like this. Wake up before dawn. He was always an early riser, even when he was rich. Walk to the Blanchet House soup kitchen for breakfast. Spend the morning walking, sometimes 15, 20 miles a day. He'd walk through the Pearl District, which, if you don't know Portland, is the neighborhood where he owned over $300 million in commercial property. He walked past his own buildings every single day, past tenants paying him rent, past doormen who worked for companies he owned. And he never went in. Not once. I want you to understand the scale of this. We mapped his daily walking route against his property holdings. On an average day, Edward Hartwell, a homeless man eating soup kitchen meals, walked within 500 feet of 23 properties he personally owned. Combined value, $412 million. There were days where he sat on a bench directly outside a building that generated $80,000 a month in rental income going into accounts with his name on them, while he ate a sandwich someone gave him at a shelter. The irony is so extreme, it almost doesn't feel real. But it's real. Every single detail of this is real. Now, the remarkable source I mentioned, his name, at least the one we're using, is Daniel Torres. And Daniel was homeless in Portland for 9 years. And for 7 of those years, he lived within 100 yards of Edward. They became friends. And Daniel's account of Edward's life on the streets is the most detailed picture we have. Daniel told us Edward went by the name Eddie. That's it, just Eddie. No last name, and according to Daniel, Eddie was the calmest person he'd ever met. He never complained. He never talked about his past. He shared whatever he had, and he read constantly, anything he could find. Newspapers, magazines, discarded books. Daniel said Eddie once read an entire encyclopedia set that someone threw out behind a Goodwill, volume by volume, over the course of a year. And there were close calls. Daniel told us about at least 4 times when someone almost recognized Edward. The closest was in 2009. A woman stopped in front of him on a park bench and stared. For what Daniel described as the longest 3 seconds of Eddie's life. She was studying his face. Edward didn't move, didn't breathe, and then she dropped $1 in his cup and walked away. When Daniel asked him about it later, Edward just said, "She knew my wife." He said it flatly, no emotion, like it was a weather report. She knew his wife. She looked right at him, and she didn't see him. Because homeless people are invisible. Remember that 4% number? This is what it looks like in practice, and I know what you're thinking, because I thought the same thing. Why didn't he just go home? He wasn't being hunted. There was no warrant, no crime. His family wanted him back. He could have walked 6 miles, knocked on his own front door, and gone back to his $800 million life. Why didn't he? I asked 3 different psychiatrists that question, and the answer they gave me isn't what you'd expect. It's not depression, at least not in the way most people understand it. It's something more specific, more rare, and honestly, way more terrifying. But I'm saving that for later, because first, I need to tell you about what happened in 2011, the year someone did recognize him. 2011, 8 years into Edward's life on the streets. A commercial property lawyer named James Chen is walking through Old Town Portland when he sees a homeless man pushing a shopping cart and stops dead in his tracks. James Chen had done legal work for Hartwell Properties in the early 2000s. He'd sat across from Edward in conference rooms, and he was 90% sure the man he was looking at was Edward Hartwell. Edward saw him looking, and for the first time in 8 years, Edward ran, not literally. He turned his cart and moved, fast, through alleys and side streets he'd clearly memorized. James followed for 3 blocks before losing him near the waterfront. But James Chen did something nobody else had done. He went straight to Margaret Hartwell and told her what he'd seen. Imagine being Margaret in that moment. 8 years. 8 years of not knowing if your husband is alive or dead. 8 years of your children asking questions you cannot answer. And now a lawyer is sitting in your living room telling you that your husband, the man you married 27 years ago, is alive. He's in Portland. He's homeless. He's 6 miles away, and he ran when someone recognized him. That last detail is the one that would break me. He's alive. He chose this. He saw someone from his old life, and his instinct wasn't to reach out. It was to run. Margaret reportedly sat in silence for a full minute after James finished talking, and then she said 5 words that still haunt me. How long do I wait? And this is where the story becomes something bigger than one man, because Margaret was faced with an impossible question. Do you go find him? Do you send the police? He's not a criminal. He's not a danger to anyone. He's a grown man who, as far as anyone can tell, is choosing to live this way. Do you have the right to drag someone back to a life they walked away from? Margaret contacted a psychiatrist. She contacted a lawyer. She contacted her pastor. And the advice she got was conflicting. Some said go. Some said wait. Some said this was a mental health crisis. Some said it was a personal choice and she needed to respect it. Meanwhile, she now knew that every time she drove over the Burnside Bridge, her husband might be directly below her. Margaret went looking for him. Twice a week for 3 months, she drove to downtown Portland and walked through the areas James Chen had described. She wore plain clothes. She didn't bring flyers this time. She didn't want to spook him. She just looked at faces, hundreds of faces, and she never found him. Whether Edward saw her coming and relocated, or whether she was simply looking in the wrong blocks, we don't know. But Daniel Torres told us something that suggests Edward knew. Daniel said that in late 2011, Eddie suddenly moved his camp from under the Burnside Bridge to a more hidden spot near the river. No explanation, he just moved, and he told Daniel, "Sometimes it's better if the people you love don't find you." That's the closest Edward ever came to admitting he had a past. Margaret eventually stopped searching, not because she gave up, but because the psychiatrist she'd been consulting told her something devastating. If he wanted to be found, he would have been found by now. Your presence in his environment may be causing him to retreat further. In other words, looking for him was pushing him away. So she stopped. She went back to her life. She told her children that their father was alive, living somewhere in Portland, and that he wasn't ready to come back. Her daughter, now 25, reportedly responded, "Then he was never the man I thought he was." Her son said nothing. He just left the room. So what was actually happening inside Edward Hartwell's mind? That's what's coming next, and it involves a psychological condition so rare that fewer than 200 cases have ever been documented. Voluntary destitution syndrome, that's the term. It's not in the DSM, It's not officially classified as a mental disorder, but it's recognized in psychiatric literature as a documented behavioral pattern where an individual with extreme financial resources deliberately abandons all wealth and assumes a life of poverty. Fewer than 200 cases have been formally documented in the last century, and before you say, "That's just being eccentric," no. This isn't a billionaire going off-grid to a cabin. This is a complete psychological severance from identity, and it almost always involves the same 3 triggers. Trigger 1, identity collapse. This is when a person reaches a point where they can no longer reconcile who they are with what they have. The money stops feeling like something they earned, and then starts feeling like a costume they're wearing. Edward fit this perfectly. Remember, he inherited his first property. He didn't build from zero. Some part of him may never have believed the wealth was really his. Trigger 2, moral incongruence. This is guilt, but deeper. It's the persistent feeling that your wealth is causing harm simply by existing, that every dollar you have is a dollar someone else doesn't. Edward's charity work, the anonymous donations, classic signs. And trigger 3, the catalytic event. One moment that converts years of internal pressure into action. For Edward, that was the phone call. Something broke on March 14, 2003, and it broke permanently. But here's where I need to challenge you on something. Because the natural reaction to this story is to say Edward was mentally ill, and maybe he was. But I spoke to Dr. Miriam Kessler, a psychiatrist who's studied 11 cases of voluntary destitution, and she said something that rewired my brain. She said, "We pathologize the choice to reject wealth because our society is built on the assumption that accumulation equals health. But what if the accumulation is the illness and the rejection is the recovery?" Sit with that for a second. What if Edward Hartwell wasn't the broken one? What if he saw something about wealth that the rest of us refuse to see? And if you think Edward is an anomaly, he's not. This pattern shows up throughout all of human history. St. Francis of Assisi was the son of a wealthy merchant who publicly stripped off his expensive clothes and lived in poverty for the rest of his life. Diogenes, the Greek philosopher, lived in a barrel and told Alexander the Great, the most powerful man on earth, to move because he was blocking the sunlight. Howard Hughes went from the richest man in America to a recluse who refused to cut his fingernails. Christopher McCandless gave away his entire savings and walked into the Alaskan wilderness. The specifics are different, but the core is identical. A person with everything concluding that everything is the problem. And I'm going to be honest with you, because I think this moment in the video requires honesty. Researching this story messed with my head, because I spend my life making videos about money, about who has it, how they got it, what they did with it, and then you encounter someone who had more money than almost anyone, and concluded that the money was the thing destroying him, and it makes you ask a question you don't really want to answer. If you had $800 million, would it make you happy? Like actually happy? Not, I can buy anything happy. Soul-level happy. I don't know if I'd answer the same way I would have before I started this project, and that's either growth or a crisis, and I honestly can't tell which. But we're not done with the mystery, because the question that haunts every single person who investigated this case is still unanswered. What was the phone call? We have 3 credible theories. Theory 1, medical diagnosis. Someone called to tell Edward he was terminally ill, and instead of burdening his family with the decline, He chose to disappear. Problem: Edward lived for 11 more years in reasonably good health. Doesn't add up. Theory 2. A whistleblower or threat related to his business. Someone called with information that his empire had legal exposure, and he ran from liability. Problem: no lawsuits were ever filed. His businesses operated normally for a decade. Theory 3, and this is the one the psychiatrist believes, is far more unsettling. Theory 3. Someone called Edward and told him something he'd been waiting to hear. Not bad news. Permission. Dr. Kessler's theory is this. Edward had been psychologically preparing to leave for at least 2 years. The canceled meetings, the sleeping alone, the anonymous donations, the comment to his lawyer about his buildings surviving without him. He was staging his own exit, but he needed one thing to finally do it. A sign, a confirmation. Dr. Kessler believes the phone call was that sign. Maybe it was a spiritual advisor. Maybe it was a therapist no one knows about. Maybe it was someone who'd done the same thing. We don't know who called, but the theory is that Edward didn't receive bad news that day. He received the last piece of courage he needed to do something he'd been planning for years. There's a version of this story where Edward Hartwell is a cautionary tale, a man who lost his mind and ruined his family. And there's another version where he's the bravest person in this entire narrative, someone who looked at a life most people would kill for and said, "This isn't real." The truth is probably somewhere in between. But the story isn't over, because in 2014, 11 years after he disappeared, Edward Hartwell's body was found on a park bench, and what they discovered in his pockets changed everything. The discovery of Edward Hartwell's body, the items in his pockets, the forensic timeline of his final days, and the revelation that shook his family to its core, that's all coming right now. And I need to warn you, what I'm about to tell you is the detail that made me stop researching, close my laptop, and go for a walk. Because it reframes every single thing you've heard in the last 30 minutes. Don't go anywhere. October 11th, 2014. A jogger in Laurelhurst Park in Portland notices a man on a bench who hasn't moved in an unusual amount of time. She approaches. She tries to rouse him. He's cold. She calls 911. Paramedics arrive at 6:47 a.m. and pronounce him dead on scene. Preliminary assessment: exposure combined with underlying cardiac issues. He had no ID, no phone, no wallet. He was wearing 3 layers of donated clothing and shoes held together with duct tape. The initial paperwork classified him as an unidentified homeless male, approximate age 60 to 65. His body was taken to the medical examiner's office and assigned a case number. Just another John Doe, except this John Doe's fingerprints. Here we're about to trigger one of the most unusual identification cases in Oregon history. Standard procedure: when an unidentified body comes in, they run fingerprints through the system. Takes about 40 minutes. The medical examiner who ran Edward's prints later told a reporter that she'd done this hundreds of times and almost never got a hit that surprised her. This one made her stand up from her chair. The match came back to Edward James Hartwell, born 1956. Last known address, Lake Oswego, Oregon, and then the financial records loaded. She saw property holdings totaling over $800 million. She saw bank accounts that had been accumulating interest for 11 years untouched. She saw a missing persons report from 2003 that had never been resolved. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor called the police. The police called Margaret Hartwell, and at 4:12 p.m., on October 11th, 2014, Margaret learned that her husband had been dead since dawn and homeless since 2003. Margaret Hartwell was making dinner when the call came. She picked up the phone, and a police officer told her that her husband's body had been found on a park bench in Laurelhurst Park. That fingerprints confirmed his identity, that he had been living as a homeless man in Portland for the past 11 years, and that he had died sometime during the previous night from cardiac arrest complicated by prolonged exposure. He was 58 years old. He was 6 miles from home. He was worth $814 million, and he died alone on a bench in a park that his own charity had helped renovate in 1997. I'm going to let that sit with you for a second before I tell you what they found in his pockets. When the medical examiner inventoried the contents of Edward Hartwell's pockets, she found 3 items. Only 3. Item 1, a worn copy of Henry David Thoreau's Walden, the same book about a man who voluntarily left society to live simply in the woods. Edward had read it so many times that the binding was held together with a rubber band. Item 2, a photograph, creased, faded, soft at the edges, from years of handling. It was a family photo, Edward, Margaret, and their 2 children, taken at a birthday party in 2001. 2 years before he disappeared, he had carried this photo in his pocket for 11 years. 11 years of sleeping on the ground, and every night that photo was with him. And item 3, a folded piece of paper, handwritten, 7 words. I am sorry. I love you all. I just couldn't carry it anymore. He wrote a note, and carried it in his pocket, instead of delivering it. For 11 years, the goodbye letter his family desperately needed was in his coat pocket, 6 miles away. He couldn't send it, but he couldn't throw it away either. Margaret Hartwell held that photograph for a very long time, the same photograph her husband had held every day for 11 years. She showed it to her children. She showed them the note. And according to the family's lawyer, the 3 of them sat at that kitchen table for nearly 2 hours, without speaking, not processing, not discussing, just existing, in the presence of an answer they'd waited 11 years for, an answer that explained everything, and nothing at the same time. I just couldn't carry it anymore. Carry what? The money, the responsibility, the identity, the guilt, the expectations? He never specified. And that ambiguity, that single word, it, is the thing that will follow this family forever, and the children's reactions were opposite, in a way that tells you everything about how trauma fractures differently. The daughter, the older one, went public. Not immediately, but within a year, she agreed to a single interview with a local journalist, and what she said was devastating in its clarity. My father had a choice. He could have gotten help. He could have talked to us. He chose to vanish instead. I love him. I will always love him. But I will never forgive him. The son, meanwhile, refused to speak publicly about his father. Ever. To this day, no interviews, no statements. He quietly left Portland, changed his last name, and has not spoken about Edward Hartwell on the record. 2 children, same father, same abandonment. Completely different survival strategies. Now, the money. And this is the detail that made financial analysts lose their minds. When Edward Hartwell disappeared in 2003, he was worth approximately $800 million. When he died in 2014, 11 years later, his estate was valued at $1.2 billion. His fortune didn't shrink while he was gone. It grew by $400 million. Because here's what we discovered. Edward had structured his property holdings so meticulously, through LLCs, management companies, and automated systems that his empire essentially ran itself. The rent kept coming in, the property values kept climbing, the accounts kept compounding. His buildings didn't need him, which, if you remember what he told his lawyer, "I need to know my buildings will survive without me," was exactly the point. Let me give you the math, because the math is insane. Edward Hartwell was homeless for approximately 4,015 days. During that time, his net worth increased by about $400 million. That means he was earning approximately $298,000 per day while sleeping under a bridge, in $12,453 per hour, including the hours he was sleeping. He was literally making more money unconscious under the Burnside Bridge than most CEOs make in a month of active work. He earned about $208 per minute while eating soup kitchen meals. The universe has a sick sense of humor. And that fact, that his fortune grew without him, proves the most disturbing part of his theory right. He believed the money didn't need him, and it didn't. But here's the inverse that's harder to accept. He also proved that he didn't need the money. He survived for 11 years with nothing. He ate, he slept, he read, he had a friend, he walked the city he loved. By his own framework, he was freer as a homeless man than he ever was as a billionaire. Now, I'm not endorsing this worldview. His family was devastated. The damage he caused is generational, but I can't sit here and tell you his logic didn't have an internal consistency. That is very hard to argue with. The funeral was small, Margaret insisted. 20 people, no press, no business associates, just family and close friends. It was held at a cemetery in Lake Oswego, less than a mile from the house Edward walked away from. And here's the detail that undid me. Daniel Torres came, Edward's friend from the streets. Margaret had tracked him down through the shelter network and personally invited him. Daniel showed up in borrowed clothes and stood in the back. He later told someone that it was the first funeral he'd ever attended, where he understood the dead man better than anyone else in the room. Margaret asked Daniel to stay after. They talked for 3 hours. She asked him about Eddie. Not Edward, Eddie. What he ate, where he slept. Was he happy? Daniel said yes. She asked, "Did he talk about us?" Daniel said, "Every day. Not in words." But he held that photograph every single night. 1 year after the funeral, Margaret Hartwell sat down with her attorneys and made a decision about the $1.2 billion estate. And I'll be honest, when I read what she did, I thought it was a typo. It wasn't. What she did with that money is, in my opinion, the most extraordinary act in this entire story. And it's coming right now. Margaret Hartwell donated $720 million, 60% of the estate, to establish the Hartwell Foundation for Invisible Lives, a foundation dedicated entirely to homelessness, mental health support, and what she called the people society decides not to see. She named it after the lesson her husband taught her from the streets, that you can be standing right next to someone in crisis and simply not see them. She split 25% between her 2 children. She allocated 10%, roughly $120 million, to Edward's former employees and their families. And she set aside 5% to ensure that Daniel Torres would never be homeless again. Daniel Torres now lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in Portland. Rent paid for life. Daniel Torres lived on the streets for 9 years. He was Edward Hartwell's closest friend during the hardest chapter of both their lives. And when Margaret asked Daniel what he wanted, he didn't ask for a mansion. He didn't ask for a car. He asked for a 1-bedroom apartment with a window that faced east. so he could see the sunrise. That's it. A man who was offered millions asked for a window, and that detail tells you something about what living with nothing teaches you, about what actually matters. Daniel now volunteers at the Blanchet house, the same soup kitchen where he and Edward used to eat breakfast. He serves meals 3 days a week. He tells new people, "You're not invisible. I see you." Remember what the daughter said right after Edward's body was found? "I love him. I will always love him, but I will never forgive him." That was 2014. In 2019, 5 years later, she gave a second interview. And what she said was completely different. She said, "I used to think my father abandoned us because he didn't love us enough. I've spent 5 years thinking about it. And I think the opposite might be true. I think the weight he felt, the weight of providing, of performing, of being Edward Hartwell, was so heavy that he believed we'd be better off without him carrying it near us. He was wrong. We needed him. But he wasn't running from us. He was trying to stop what he was becoming, from reaching us." She paused, and then she said, "I still haven't forgiven him, but I understand him now. And understanding is almost enough." We live in a culture that worships accumulation. We make videos about it. We rank people by it. Okay, we structure our entire society around the assumption that more money equals more life. And then along comes a man who had $800 million, more than most of us will see in 1,000 lifetimes. And he looked at all of it and said, "This is not life. This is a prison I built for myself." And I need you to reckon with the possibility that he might have been right. Not entirely right. Not right in his methods. His family didn't deserve what he did, but right in his diagnosis, that somewhere along the way, we confused the accumulation of wealth with the accumulation of meaning. And those are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. Edward Hartwell's tragedy is not that he died on a bench. It's that he felt he had to choose between his fortune and his soul. And a healthy society would never force that choice. So where is everyone now? Margaret Hartwell, now 67, runs the Hartwell Foundation full-time. In its first decade, the foundation has funded 37 permanent housing projects and 12 mental health clinics across the Pacific Northwest. She told a reporter last year, "Edward gave me a mission. I just wish he'd given it to me in person." The daughter became a therapist. She specializes in grief, identity, and what she calls the trauma of unanswered questions. She has a practice in Seattle. She keeps a copy of Walden on her desk. Not because she's forgiven her father, because she wants her patients to know that understanding someone doesn't require forgiving them. The son lives a private life under a different name. He declined to participate in any aspect of this project. We respect that completely. And Daniel Torres is still in his apartment, still volunteers at Blanchet House, still watches the sunrise every morning. I want to end with something personal. I've been making videos about extraordinary people for a long time, and I usually walk away from a story thinking, "That was wild," and moving on to the next one. This one didn't let me do that. I went home after finishing the research, and I sat in my living room and I looked around at my stuff, my setup, my equipment, the things I've bought because I thought they meant I was making progress. And for the first time, I felt the weight Edward was talking about. Not the weight of poverty, the weight of ownership, the feeling that your things own you, more than you own them. I'm not about to go live under a bridge, but I'll tell you this. I haven't looked at money the same way since I started this project, and I don't think I ever will again. And there are questions we will never answer. Who made the phone call on March 14th, 2003? The caller ID showed unknown, and no record was ever found. We may never know. The handwritten note, "I am sorry, I love you all, I just couldn't carry it anymore." Handwriting analysis suggests it was rewritten multiple times over many years, which means Edward sat under bridges and in shelters year after year, rewriting a note he never sent, revising his goodbye like it was a draft. That was never good enough. And perhaps the biggest question, did he ever try to go home? Daniel Torres told us there were nights when Edward walked in the direction of Lake Oswego and came back hours later without explanation. Did he get close? Did he stand outside his own house? Did he watch his children through a window? We will never know. Some doors, once closed, don't reopen, even when they're unlocked. Edward Hartwell's story is not a blueprint, it's not a how-to, it's not aspirational. A man abandoned his family, broke his children, and died alone. That is a tragedy, by any measure, but it's a tragedy that asks a question. Most of us are too comfortable to face. What are you carrying that you don't need? Not money, specifically. Maybe it's an identity you built for other people, a career you chose to impress someone who's no longer watching, a version of success that was handed to you before you were old enough to define it for yourself. Edward Hartwell couldn't put down what he was carrying and stay in his life at the same time. That was his failure. The question for the rest of us is, can you put it down without leaving? Can you redefine what enough means before the weight forces a decision you can't take back? There's a copy of Walden on a bench in Laurelhurst Park. Someone put it there a few years ago. It's been replaced a few times when weather gets to it. Nobody knows for sure who started it. Inside the front cover, someone wrote, "For whoever finds this, the simplest truths are the last ones we learn." People pick it up. Some read it, some put it back, some take it home. And every time someone sits on that bench and opens that book, Edward Hartwell's story gets one more chapter. He wanted to be invisible. He ended up being unforgettable, and the irony of that would probably make him laugh. All right, I need to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer this in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious what you think. Here's the question. If you found out tomorrow that you had $800 million, but keeping it meant you'd spend the rest of your life feeling like Edward Hartwell felt, that weight, that disconnect, that sense that the money was erasing who you actually are, would you keep it? One word in the comments. Keep or walk. That's it. I'm going to read every single one, because I've been going back and forth on my own answer for 4 months, and I genuinely don't know where I land. Keep or walk? Tell me. Now, if this story hit you the way it hit me, you need to see what we're releasing next, because we found another story that is equally insane, but goes in the completely opposite direction. A person who had nothing, and built a fortune so large that when the IRS audited them, they literally didn't believe it was real. The numbers in that story make Edwards look modest. It's linked right here, and it's already live. Click it. You will not regret it. Before you go, I want to say something real for a second. This video took 4 months to make. It's the most research-intensive thing we've ever produced. And if you watched this far, all the way to this point, you're not a casual viewer. You're the kind of person who cares about stories that actually mean something. This is your kind of channel. Subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.